And we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, lovely humans currently enjoying this video and joining us. I am Alex Grandstaff, pronouns they, them, theirs, organizer of the Masters and Johnson Sexuality Symposium, which you are currently watching a video for. A quick reminder that the symposium is intended for audiences 18 and up, since we are dealing with content related to sex and sexuality. And you are currently watching the session of Relational Wellbeing among youth engaged in commercial sex. And I am very, very excited to be talking today with Zoe Webb and Caleb Bay. And I'm going to hand it over to them to give us a brief introductions. And also, if both of y'all could give us some content warnings for anything you think folks might want to be aware of for the video.
Yeah. Well, hello, everyone. So my name is Caleb Bay, and I am a graduate student at the Brown School, getting my master's in social work, specializing in mental health and concentrating in mental health, specializing in sexual health and education. And my goal is to assist young people in empowering themselves to create enriching lives. And incorporate non-traditional techniques like adventure therapy, music and theater programming, and gameplay into therapies to support gender and sexuality non-conforming youth and youth who have experienced complex trauma. And yeah, I guess some of the stuff that we'll be talking about today includes sex trafficking and other forms of commercial sex. So if that is a sensitive subject, be aware of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. My name is Zoe Webb. I'm from Atlanta. I am currently an undergraduate student at Georgia State, and I study social work and gender studies with a focus on youth homelessness. I'm currently working at Stand Up for Kids, which is a nonprofit in Atlanta, as the Associate Director of Mentoring and Street Outreach. And we provide community support and harm reduction for youth experiencing homelessness in Atlanta. And I'm really excited to be here. I agree with those content warnings. We're talking about people who are, messing with consent, and sometimes it's not there and sometimes it is. And if that is something that makes you uncomfortable, just be aware of that.
Fantastic. I'm just super excited right now. So I'm going to bring us right into it. Before we get started, I'd like to start with laying the groundwork of let's define a few terms that we're going to be working with, starting with commercial sex. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question and an interesting one, because it is, in a sense, the groundwork for the conversation, and in part the core of what we're going to talk about, and one of the main messages I think that Zoe and I have. So, because commercial sex can also be thought of as transactional sex. It's another term that we use, and they can be used interchangeably, but have some different connotations and different meanings sometimes. So they aren't identical, but those can be kind of similar. But the real core of what commercial sex is and how we're going to talk about it is the exchange of money or goods for sexual services.
So commercial sex, exchange for, never mind.
Yeah, exchanging money or goods for sexual services.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you. All right, so then that brings us to, wait, sorry, Zoe, do you have a build off?
No, I think, it's the simpler the better when it comes to these things.
Yeah, keep it straightforward. These are our foundational building blocks, and folks can definitely search these terms to try and build out. But then, so we come to what's survival sex work in this context?
Yeah, so then survival sex is a form of commercial sex, right? It is an exchange, but in particular, that's looking at exchange of sexual services for money or goods or services that are needed to meet basic survival needs. So an example would be someone having sex with a partner who has an apartment because they don't have any place to stay, and if I have sex, I can stay in this apartment with an individual, because that's a basic need of shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be considered survival sex.
So then just to build basic needs, we're thinking like you just said, shelter, food, water, like those core kind of resources of care and safety.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is one of my big posts, so I really want us to get into this distinction of the distinction between sex work and sex trafficking.
Yeah, so sex trafficking, and I think this is in particular an interesting term to define because it has different definitions depending on context. So there's the legal definition is sexual services obtained through force, fraud, or coercion for individuals 18 or over. But any kind of transactional sex, commercial sex for minors is considered legally sex trafficking. I think conceptually, the way how I tend to think about it, and that I know Zoe and I have talked about, is that sex trafficking is a subset of commercial sex that involves exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that like these definitions are not mutually exclusive, and we have these definitions a lot of times for legal reasons. It is illegal to do sex work, but our community is invested in helping people who are experiencing exploitation. So it gets really complicated when we're trying to differentiate where the line is between one or the other. But sex work is like this voluntary transactional sex. So someone who may not be doing this to meet their basic needs, but just to make money. It's a job, you know. People do sex work for the same reasons that they choose any other job. And a lot of times it is the best option if you're trying to make a certain amount of money in a certain set of time. A lot of people can't make a living wage at most jobs. So, yeah.
Yeah, and on that note of that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive and where you might try to draw a line between some of these terms, we'll get into this more as we go through our conversation, but it can be difficult to distinguish things based on some of these assumed criteria that we assume it's, okay, survival sex is because you have a need to survive. We assume that is a distinct thing, but then as we peel it back and we're talking about it, you start to question, well, what counts as basic needs and what counts as survival? Because I pay for my housing with money that I get from a job. And so if we talk about sex work as a job and not survival sex, but I'm getting it to get money, but you use that money to pay for your housing. So that is to meet a need. And so where do you draw that line for, is this as directly tied to my survival and to meet basic needs? And there's a similar conversation we have when we talk about the role of consent. And on its face value, sex trafficking is defined with this coercion and fraud and force. And so you might say, okay, sex trafficking comes when there's no consent. But in other situations, you might have consent in transactional sex. And as we peel it back, we start to see that there's more nuance to consent, and there's a lot involved in figuring out like what is a choice on the face and how much choice really goes into that. And even just looking at the survival sex, and I have a choice to participate, to engage in this. I'm not being coerced to, but just the need for money in itself is a form of coercion. So how much choice do I really have? So it gets messy, which is intellectually I find very exciting. And I like talking about messy conversations, but also important to remember that these have real consequences, and people's lives are really dramatically affected by this mess, because that influences how we interpret our choices and our relationships and our engagement with others.
Yeah, I feel like this is just a lot of times a conversation about the nature of work under capitalism. Like, where do we have a choice, and where are we learning to build those choices, not just in our work lives, but also in our personal lives, which I think is something that we're going to expand on more later. But I'm particularly really fascinated by the idea that exploitation is not really something that you can necessarily define easily as like something outside of yourself. I often think of exploitation as like a feeling or a power dynamic. And often a feeling of, oh, I don't have control here. And so figuring out, we understand that those feelings, those power dynamics shift between time and space and between relationships. So it's very hard to make like a distinct separation between these definitions when, if consent is constantly shifting, then we know that exploitation is as well. So somebody who does engage in voluntary sex work may walk into a scenario or be, 30 minutes into a session and be like, oh, wait, something changed. This doesn't feel good. Or you may be, with your partner who you sleep with to stay with them, and then their brother comes over and suddenly things are different. It's 2 against 1. It's always about these shifting power dynamics, and it's always about these like messy conversations of, these systemic factors that are constantly shaping our like interpersonal relationships and moment to moment transactions.
I could definitely drag us into a like oxbow lake of talking about labor rights particularly in the context of the United States, and how the sex work industry really highlights labor exploitation and like labor protection and how that framework is in this country. But don't want to take us off topic. Y'all really hit those like core notes very beautifully, and I'm very thrilled by that. And I think you already started kind of diving into the next point that I wanted us to cover, which is sort of the thing of
before we jump into that point, I do want to say that conversation on labor is, I don't think it is off topic. I think right there, I think they're really meshed, because that's one of the really interesting things when we start talking about sex trafficking in particular, because sex trafficking dominates the conversation on both human trafficking and commercial sex, but it's actually the minority of what's going on in both of those spaces. The majority of human trafficking is labor trafficking, and the majority of commercial sex is not sex trafficking per se, but it's dominating the conversation. So yeah, I think these are really integrally linked, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But yeah, I think talking about labor and the way our economic system is set up around labor is not at all off topic.
I think I hope we'll dive back into that a little bit later, because I think there's the dynamic of, in particular, in the work I have done around sex work and how sex trafficking gets conflated into there. I've noticed a lot, the reason why labor trafficking outside of sex seems to disappear, I think, is because of our culture's arrangement of values around sex and how it creates this sort of hyper focus.
Absolutely.
We'll bring that back. We'll bring that back in that discussion of how, when we're working with youth who might be engaging in transactional sex, we can have our own value system, and the sort of dominant squishing value system push us into places that probably aren't actually what the people we're working with need from us.
Absolutely.
But before we get into there, y'all have already kind of hit some of the bases, but why do youth get into survival sex work?
I think that's a great question. And it's a great question because it leads to a much bigger question, which is like, why are these kids getting into situations where their basic needs are not being met? Right? So the youth who are like systemically vulnerable are always going to be more vulnerable to exploitation. So if you're in a position where your basic needs are getting met, you're homeless, you're experiencing wage theft, you're experiencing labor exploitation already. If your immigration status is not where it's supposed to be, if you have an expansive gender identity, you will always be in a position where you have less choice, where you're in a a more precarious power dynamic with others who have more like systemically linked power. But on a more intricate level, I mean, I've worked with plenty of kids who had interpersonal relationships that at time to time, and sometimes originally, were organized around survival sex. So you may have a boyfriend who, like we said before, you have a boyfriend who you live with, and you have sex with him so that you can stay with him. It can look like that. It can look like, doing street-based sex work, and that is how you meet your basic needs. That's how you make enough money to eat lunch, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I think it is always, these conversations on sex work are always going to be conversations about the criminal justice system. They're always going to be conversations about immigration. And again, going back to the point that like youth choose survival sex, youth choose sex work for the same reasons that they choose any other like boring and sometimes degrading job. Yeah, Caleb, do you want to build off that?
Yeah, well, I think you did a great job. Yeah, considering that background on a lot of reasons that might lead youth into situations. And just off of that last note on the choice, I think it's really interesting. And again, something that we'll keep revisiting. What is this idea of choice and levels of choice? That many youth engaging in survival sex do say it's a choice, right? And they don't. They're not saying I've been forced into this. That's a different thing. But again, those questions on coercion, because they at the same time, researchers have talked with youth about their youth engaging in survival sex, about their attitudes towards it. They say, yeah, this is a choice, is something I'm choosing because these benefits that I'm getting from it. But at the same time, if I wasn't in this situation, I wouldn't make this choice. Not all of them, but many of them. And so that just highlights that the complexity in that choice, and something that we'll talk about more later, is that recognizing the context of the choice and the factors that are influencing that choice does not mean we're taking away that choice. And that's an important part of working with young people in honoring that. And they're saying, this is my choice. In a different context, I'd be making a different choice, but that can still be my decision in this context. So we're not taking away from that, but just also acknowledging that they're in a context. It's not totally a free choice. If I was in a vacuum, this is what I'd want to be doing. Yeah, it's complex that way.
And I think there's something that I wanted to pull out real quick from what y'all said, because I think, at least in the conversations I've had with folks who aren't familiar, people don't register the idea of like, oh, I am staying with my partner and I have sex with them so that they will let me stay at their apartment because I don't have housing. Otherwise, they don't register that as being transactional sex in the same way. It's framed in this sort of way of like, that you can be with someone you have an ongoing relationship with, as opposed to a thing of like, I coordinate with a customer and I see them once and then we part ways and like things are immediately exchanged. So I think, can we circle back to, and y'all maybe give a few more examples of how like transactional sex can actually play out in much more complicated ways than folks think?
Yeah, I think, Zoe mentioned earlier that the arrangements can shift, right? And they can be these gradual shifts. And so that's part of, not all, but part of the reason why someone might say, no, this isn't a transactional relationship. And that's another matter that I think we're planning to touch on later, about how we on the outside, we're trying to label something or identify some behavior, and want to caution about saying, you don't understand what you're doing, but this is what you're doing. But that is a factor of it, is that they might not label it in such a way or consider it, but it has at least elements of transactional sex. And sometimes that happens because it is this gradual shift. And maybe, they moved in with this partner, they had their own apartment, and then they moved in with this partner, and then as time goes on, well, now I don't have the resources I did have. It was totally voluntary choice, but now I don't have my own apartment. And so if I break up, if I stop having sex, if we end this engagement, then I'm in a precarious situation. And so the power dynamics, as Zoe was talking about, they continue to shift, and that can change over time. You know, and it's not necessarily even something, you know, neither of the partners in that situation might be aware of that. It's just, oh, this relationship's not working anymore. In other contexts, we could break up, we could stop sleeping together. But because our resources are so entangled, my survival, meeting my needs, is now tied to this. So yeah, it can just get complicated that way.
Yeah, I also think that, you know, survival sex doesn't have to be inherently exploitive. It doesn't have to be inherently abusive, you know. I know plenty of people who have been really happy with their arrangements, and those arrangements may shift. They may turn at some point to not be beneficial to them, but they can work out really well. And, you know, I think that, yeah, I think about the kids that I've worked with, and, you know, you can think about this from like a perspective of research, and I do, but I also think in a lot of times in terms of individual people, and how so many of the kids that I've worked with are so intuitive, and, you know, it may never have been spoken that they're supposed to have sex with their friend's friend to like stay in their basement, but they know, you know what I mean? And I'm thinking, you know, specifically about how these things roll out. You know, a lot of my kids stay in hotels, so there's like a whole other world that can happen inside like a motel. So if you can't pay for your hotel room anymore, but your neighbor, he can pay for his hotel room, but you have to sleep with his boss to stay in his motel room. You know what I mean? Because his boss pays for his hotel room. So like these power dynamics are always so intricate. And I think that it's actually to the benefit of these kids and possibly our clients that they're learning how to navigate these. You know, that's amazing. That's a skill that a lot of people in, you know, these non-exploitive situations are never going to develop. And understanding that skill, understanding that resourcefulness is really important, I think, in working with people in this kind of population.
So like talking about that kind of elasticity that youth are developing in order to like of adapting to situations rapidly and noticing how things switch in order to kind of keep themselves in a position that like allows them to access resources, reduces like the risk of what might happen if they don't engage in this. Can we build a little bit on there of like, how does that start to impact their relationship lenses?
Yeah, you know, it's just as much as the choice and the nature of leading them into it is complicated, the impact is equally or more complicated. And a lot of this is because we often talk about sex work specifically as work, right? And we, you know, that's one of the catchy slogans, sex work is work. And it is. It's also not just work, at least not all the time. There's a relational element. And, you know, this is true of other jobs too, that, you know, my last job, one of the common things coworkers would say is, came here for this reason, I stayed because of the coworkers. And there's a relational element, and, you know, work gets tied up because we're social beings. But in transactional sex in particular, there's a very relational element, and sex work is work, but it's not just about categorizing labor. And so when, especially for young people who are engaging in sexual relationships that are so conflated with these matters of choice and all these other factors about their needs and their stability, that gets really mixed in, that can get really mixed into how they view relationships. And again, this isn't a catch-all, but it can have that impact. And so, you know, you can imagine if, especially again, going back to that element of choice, and I'm choosing to be in this relationship, but there's still this transactional expectation. So then, do all relationships have a transactional expectation? In a way, kind of, yes, if you're looking at, social contracts and just like having standards for yourself. And, we talk a lot about boundaries. And so that's an expectation for the other person and how they're going to engage with me. But it's different. And so it's very messy. And so it starts to really blur a lot of this, even more than it already is blurred. And so, this relationship is I'm entering into voluntarily, some element of voluntarily, but it's still business-like in some aspects. So are these other relationships, just with even friends or other sexual or other romantic partners, are those how business-like are those? And so it can start to influence your perception of relationships that way. And the other thing I want to talk about is the perception of safety and risk, but I really like how Zoe talks about this, so I'm going to invite you to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that was a great point. And yeah, just sort of understanding how your relationships work. This is a period of time, if we're talking about youth, this is a period of time when they're developing their patterns for forming relationships in the future. And engaging in sex work, engaging in survival sex work involves a certain level of risk, right? And depending on how vulnerable you already are, you may be constantly in a situation of danger or risk. And part of how a lot of youth move through that is by learning how to sort of numb out that instinct of danger, like this feels wrong, I am in danger, this could go wrong, I am being hurt, et cetera, et cetera. And that instinct, that feeling is part of what keeps us alive. It's part of what keeps us being able to differentiate, this is, I feel safe here, I don't feel safe here. And if you've blocked that out, then you're in danger all the time because you have no way of being able to differentiate those situations. And similarly with that, it's a lot harder, I think, for people who have been in that situation to recognize when they're safe, which is equally as important for building relationships in the future. And if we're thinking about working with clients and kind of figuring out how to use these experiences that they've had of transactional sex to understand interpersonal relationships throughout their lifetime, rebuilding that sense of instinct, that sense of safety, that sense of danger is going to be really important in allowing them to have healthy relationships, not just with others, but with themselves.
Yeah, because it recalibrates what you're looking for, what you're expecting. So on that point of it also influencing, when can we recognize safety? I see a lot of young people who have not had stable relationships that they can really trust in a relationship for its own sake, and start looking for what are they looking for from me? Where is this transaction? And then when some really great relationships come along, it feels weird because they've calibrated to be expecting something different. So we see a lot of self-sabotage, and youth get into positive situations, safe situations, and it just doesn't feel right because they're not used to it. So they get themselves out of there, and they lose that safety and that positive support because they're not used to it. And I want to highlight too, right here, because we're talking so much about risk, that is a big part of the conversation with commercial sex among youth, because it is risky in a lot of ways, and it can have these impacts. And a lot of the conversation focuses on physical risks, physical safety, contracting STIs, that kind of thing. And a lot of what we're talking about in this conversation is the relational risks, which I think is underappreciated often. But even just still talking about the risks, I want to stress that it's not all just risks. And like Zoe said earlier, figuring out how to navigate that and to respond to different needs and the resourcefulness. There's a lot of skills that young people developed in navigating this, and and developing this resiliency. And I want to make sure that our viewers know that we celebrate those too, and don't look at survival sex and transactional sex and all these things as purely negative, but want to hold those complicated benefits and challenges simultaneously.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about conversations I've had with experienced sex workers and things I've read, and like work that I've read by sex workers, talking about how, like a lot of different industries where there is direct customer, like retail, like therapy, social work, any industry where you are doing direct client interaction, there is the part that people clearly can define as work, but we don't notice the parts that are emotional labor, that are the, like, you are building a relationship. And like sex workers will talk about how that takes a lot of skills to create these boundaries for themselves of like, here I am as the person who is working with you, and I am making a relationship happen with you that you are believing, that you are feeling, that is genuine, while still protecting like my mental and psychological well-being. And I think a thing I'm kind of picking up from y'all is a situation that can happen with youth engaging in this is they may not have that, like, they may not have those skills yet to develop that for their like emotional frameworks in this. And so it becomes this bleeding of context, which I do think happens in other industries as well.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about it, of how like, oh, look, someone's getting groomed in their job to accept all of these boundary pushes. And then it shows up in how they are with their friends and how they might be with like family or potential partners. And like there's this sort of bleeding through that happens that can sort of kind of jack up that like locus of trust in reading a situation and understanding green flags versus red flags, and just kind of creates that straight, like, can also lead into things I think of hyper independence in terms of relationship building.
I thank you very much for adding that point about how sex work incorporates the emotional labor and all of this. And that's one of the things I appreciate hearing too from sex workers about, not just emotional labor, but also spiritual labor on top of the physical labor that is maybe more obvious, but like it really, you bring yourself as a whole person. And like you were talking about, that is hard enough when you are approaching it as sex work and saying, how do I engage in this way while keeping appropriate boundaries and protecting myself in the ways that I need to? Like, that's a difficult thing to navigate. And for youth who are engaging in transactional sex, and like we said, not thinking about it in that way necessarily, then it's even more challenging, because it's, I'm not approaching it like Zoe was saying, as this discrete client that I'm engaging with this one time. It might start as an ongoing relationship, or it might flow into an ongoing relationship. And so then, that's something that we navigate in relationships anyways, about setting our boundaries and figuring out how much you're able to give into that emotional and spiritual labor and all that. But yeah, when you're working in this space that blurs the choice and the consent and how voluntary it is, it blurs those aspects as well. And it's challenging enough when you're going into it thinking about it as sex work, and when you're not thinking about it as sex work necessarily, that can be even more challenging.
I wanted to give a pause in case you want.
No, I know. I'm thinking. I was like, I'm gonna say something, and I was like, I'm not gonna say something, because I feel like that was really good. I feel like y'all hit the point.
No, that was. Thank you. It's complicated and important to recognize that it is complicated, and So I guess
actually, I have one more point.
Go for it.
I'm talking a ton, but I just don't want to. I want to make sure we don't miss it. Maybe it'll fit in somewhere else. But while we're on the point of hearing from sex workers about their experience and the complicated nature of the simultaneously holding different realities of it, I just want to stress like how much actually talked with some sex workers last week who, it was just so evident that they were excited and laughing with each other about their work, and they take so much, get so much joy from it and get so much energy from it. They really enjoy it. And in the same conversation are crying about it because of the inherent risks and because of assault on sex workers and, all these challenges that go with it. And in that same conversation, just like pure joy and laughter and tears. And that's, reality is complicated. And so when we try to distill things into simple slogans, we can miss a lot of that. I think that is really important when you're working with people who are engaging in transactional sex or have engaged in transactional sex or thinking about engaging in transactional, all these things. Just look at the reality. Don't, it's important to not make assumptions based on simplified, distilled messages that might be politicized, that are thrown out for a certain agenda. Not that the agenda is good or bad, but they might have an intent. And when we're working with individuals, it's important to recognize that their reality is going to be much more expansive than those slogans.
Yeah, I am really into policy, like as in legislation and like government, and like things I think about a lot are like how Sesta Fosta back in 2018, but also this has been going on in the country forever. I believe it's the Milk Act. I always forget this guy's name. Basically, Sesta Fosta's great-great-granddaddy. Same situation of like we have this governmental like stigmatization of sex work that leads to this space of traumatization through like the fact of if something bad happens during your work, like you're assaulted, a client robs you, like those acts that do happen that people talk about a lot as why sex work is bad. Those things happen because of stigmatization that does in part, like it's more complicated. Everything is always more complicated. But if you don't have recourse in your work, to have protections in your labor, because if you try and get help from systems, you will either be funneled into something or potentially be pushed into the carceral system, thrown in jail. Like that's going to make your job way harder.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, that's one of the points that it feels the most important to me is that one of the number one ways that you can help people who are victims of trafficking, one of the number one ways that you can help people who are exploited through sex work is by decriminalizing sex work. Because if you can't move forward in a safe way to get help, there's no way that you'll be able to escape your circumstances, period. And criminalization is oftentimes what makes sex work so dangerous. So many sex workers have such, oh God, just like thinking about the number of stories I've heard of sex workers who were victimized by cops or in jail, et cetera, et cetera. It can be just like devastating.
And also, I think there's the point to build off of too, of not just from like threat of the police state and prison systems. There's also the issue of because sex work is not legitimized as labor, you don't have access to entire social safety nets that other people do. That happened with COVID. We saw like particularly sex workers who were strippers did not get access to the same relief that there's many people who fell through gaps with the way the thing was structured. And we could get into that, but that's a whole other thing.
We really could get into that. There's so much there.
Because that also then ties into how people get into survival sex work. Because golly gee, if you can't access the support systems that are supposed to help you get back on your feet, and you can't access above board legal considered labor, suddenly like bump, 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 like your options are radically shifting.
Yeah.
But you still have to eat and find somewhere to sleep.
Exactly.
But let me zooming out a minute, scooping back out of I'm gonna give y'all a question stack here of when we're thinking about youth and sex work. I think a lot of conversations I've had with folks who like just also aren't potentially, sex work is still a newer thing for them to talk about outside of frames of just like trafficking, bad, is like there's this sort of response. We're going back into that culture space of how we feel about sex, how we feel about the sex industry, of no, you can't do that. And like this desire to have them exit the sex industry completely, or exit any kind of transactional models. And how does this, when we have that response, how does that impact the trust building that we're doing with youth? So that's the first on the stack. And then the second on the stack is, how can practitioners ground ourselves to be present with youth rather than trying to just push our own like values and ideas about sex work and about things in general relating to sex onto them?
I think it's really important for providers to recognize and understand the fact that youth are making choices that are a product of their circumstances. And oftentimes these decisions are, they're making pragmatically informed decisions. So this has to do with all issues around harm reduction. I think I love the conversation on harm reduction. So
Same,
yes.
sorry.
No, exactly. So even just like taking a step back and, like there's a similar conversation on drug usage. So understanding that like kids that sleep on the street, it's beneficial for them to use drugs. If they're using certain drugs, they don't have to sleep as much. They don't have to eat as much. They don't get cold. And, there are all these other factors that like, it's actually better for them to make these choices that we may see as moralistically bad, wrong, et cetera, et cetera.
Or at least in some ways, right? It doesn't even not necessarily like better overall, but like there are benefits. They're not just
Yes. Thank you for bringing me back.
It is helping them cope.
Yeah. I tend to make
we
these
talk about like maladaptive coping.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's just purely bad. There's a reason it's adaptive in some way with with bad side effects. There are bad things that go along with it, but there are benefits. There's reasons for it. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. I am constantly making these statements. It's like everything is like this, and Caleb's always like, okay, let's take a step back. Not everything's like that. It's helpful for me. But yeah, and understanding what our role is like as professionals. We're not here to tell somebody how to live their life. We're here to help you build a life that feels worth living and feels wonderful. And I think that one of the ways that we can do that is understanding where they're coming from, understanding the circumstances that have brought them to these decisions, and then also taking a step back. The conversation on sex work, the conversation on trafficking is so politicized, like we were talking about earlier. It has this like moralistic urgency. And a part of one of the ways that Caleb and I have been talking about, like the antidote to that is really taking a step back and recognizing the relational aspects in place. I think I'm gonna hand it over to you, Caleb.
Yeah. Well, I want to, so on that aspect of like considering the situation, I don't think this is adding anything, but some words work better for certain people. So just want to offer like one way that I think about it is like saying no, don't do that is just naive. It's just impractical. Like, even if you want to get someone to stop doing it, that's just not going to work. You can't just say, no, don't do this. And you can't even say, don't do this because these are all the risk factors. The researchers who have talked with youth engaging in survival sex and older adults engaging in survival sex have seen that by and large, folks engaging in survival sex and other forms of commercial sex, they understand the risk factors. They evaluated it and said, I'm going with this because of these benefits, like Zoe was saying. Right. And so it's not, there is a piece of education and making sure that they're aware, and in that harm reduction model, education is a big part of it. It's like, okay, you can do this. And if you're doing it, these are some ways to do it that will keep you more safe. So education is part of it, but you can't expect that you have the magic information that will change their lives, because sometimes it's not about information. It's just about the reality that they're in. So saying don't do that is just impractical. And especially in an ongoing relationship with a service provider, if you are a social worker, a therapist, or some kind of professional, that's really damaging to the relationship, because you're revealing this ignorance that then the youth starts to question even more, like, why should I listen to you? And a lot of youth, especially youth who are on the streets engaging in survival sex and marginalized and disadvantaged in these ways, are already having a hard time with trust, because the relationships are marked by this, like, you want something from me. So it's already, you go into a therapeutic relationship and say, okay, what are you trying to get from me? And so it's difficult to trust. And then you're showing that I don't understand what you're going through, because I'm just telling you to stop. That's even harder to trust. So it's impractical. And then to Zoe's second point about it, it's just a respect thing. And it's just a big part of it is just, we as a society and our culture needs to get better about honoring young people and their ability to make those choices. And we're talking earlier about about questioning how much choice is there. And, you wouldn't be doing it if you were in a different context, or are you really choosing it, or how much are you choosing it? But then if you question that too much and you stress that and say, it's just your context, we can get you out of that, and you're trying to take that choice away, that's not empowering, right? So when we're working with youth, we want to empower them to be self-sufficient, to be able to identify what is safe, what is not safe, all those things that we were talking about earlier. And for them to build those skills, to be able to do that, they need to have that agency. And so, it really just comes back to respecting youth and understanding that they are people who have control over their lives. And if you want to assist them in empowering and enriching their lives, you're doing just that. You're doing the assist. You're not taking over. Right. And then it also, going to your point, Alex, about some more tangible things about how practitioners can ground ourselves and work with youth. A lot of that, I think, these conversations create an opportunity to talk with youth about relationships in general. You can use these engagements in transactional and survival sex to talk about what are healthy relationships. And like Zoe said earlier, survival sex does not necessarily mean it's exploitative, mean it's bad. You can come to an agreement that could be work for everyone. That doesn't mean it's an unhealthy relationship. So we can identify what is making this relationship work for you. And in these relationships that you don't feel comfortable, that you do feel like something's off and you feel exploited, what about it is feeling exploited? You can start to identify those things, and going back to that kind of idea of calibration and getting stuck in that survival mode. Then you identify these things, and you can start to recalibrate and say, what am I looking for in relationships? What are the positive impacts that I can have? And then that empowers youth to be making their own choices about what relationships they want to enter into and stay in.
So I love this. I think because I think a thing that also comes up, I notice, is I think we, without realizing it, become, and Caleb, I think you were getting into this, and Zoe as well, we patronize youth and assuming that they don't understand the risks of the situation they are in, that they have not firsthand experienced, like, okay, this, like, they know because they're they're in the thing, and they've also probably tried other options, and this is like, this is the situation that makes sure I have a place to stay tonight. This is the situation that makes sure my food is taken care of for the week. Like, this gets me what I need now with the resources that I have. And I like that y'all highlight the idea of like, it's not about, and I think this is regardless of who we are working with, we are not about taking away choices. It's about expanding options and helping people build their own scaffolding by talking through the situations and experiences they already have, and highlighting of okay, exactly what Caleb, you were saying like, this is what I like about this. This is what I don't like about this. Like, how can I change these things of like treating youth as if they are in fact people with thoughts, feelings, and experiences and desires.
Yeah, young people have some similarities to people. It's almost like they're people.
How strange. What? Forgive me, that was probably a bit too far on my part.
It was maybe helpful to clarify that was sarcastic.
Yes, that was definitely sarcasm. I have a lot of feelings about the ways we like disenfranchise youth by like putting them in a very strange position. I feel that way about like straight up children as well. Like,
yeah.
Did you know we don't become human at a certain stage in life? We're that way the whole way through.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting point in talking about like the developmental stage. And Zoe, you were hitting on this earlier about the developmental stage, and in that a lot of models of human development, like Erikson's model, the stages of development, which is really commonly cited. He proposed that in adolescence, folks are attending to matters of identity, trying to figure out identity. And once you figure out identity, then early adulthood is about figuring out intimacy. And it's this very sequential stage. And I think it feeds into that, what you were saying, Alex, about at this point, we become a person in this regard where intimacy matters. And I think this very reductive, and it relies on this very individualistic model where I have to figure out me before I can enter into a relationship. But more and more, we're opening up those models and seeing, that those relationships matter across the life course, and you can see that by looking between cultures, and in more collectivist societies like China, where they study intimacy in adolescence, it's not presumed that identity must come first. And in fact, there's a lot of findings that intimacy, and not just like romantic intimacy, but with peers, with friends, precedes feelings of having a sense of purpose in life and that identity. And so these things about identity and intimacy go hand in hand, and they mix together. And so, we're talking about young people engaging in survival sex. I think that's part of why the fact that transactional sex is relational is so important, is because it's not that they're trying to figure out intimacy later. Like, this is something that they're navigating right now. They're trying to figure out what is intimacy as I'm trying to figure out what is identity. And that's why the relational nature of transactional sex is so impactful.
I love the idea that like I hashed out all of my identities by 19. What a wonderful thought.
Yeah.
Totally done now. No, that's for folks who are not familiar with a lot of life models. Erikson in particular likes to do this thing where we're emotionally we develop like a frog develops from a tadpole. So we just start from these different layers, and like, all right, you've completed this stage and now you've grown some legs, and like at this stage you've lost your tail, but it's like psychological, as Caleb was just saying about finding your purpose or developing intimacy. No, we move more fluidly than that. These models are helpful, but not like concrete. Zoe, I'm sorry, I had to have a moment.
No, that's a really good point. That's a very good point. I think it kind of brings up this conversation of mandated reporting, which is super complicated for providers, and kind of what we were talking about before, like if somebody is under the age of 18 and engaging in any kind of transactional sex, that's considered trafficking. And what changes from the day you turn 17 to 18, and what tools are we assuming that you've gotten at that point? And that's actually a really good question. What tools do we think we need to be able to make these decisions of consent? And if we can talk about that with youth of all ages, that's an opportunity to really build some foundational measures for them to, organize their lives in a way that's empowering and allows them to make more choices instead of us making choices for them, like we were talking about before earlier.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's important to consider both sides of that we're assuming pre-18, you don't have those tools, and post-18, you must have those tools.
Right.
And neither is necessarily true.
There's that is definitely one of the core foundations in my work, passion fuel of, we don't building back to that scaffolding of like, there's no magic manual that falls out of the sky on your 18th birthday to like give you all of these interpersonal skills.
Right.
And yet legally, there is this idea of like, from the last night you were 17 into the night you were 18, the day that you turn 18, suddenly you are in the eyes of like the law, and also in the eye, which impacts then how all these different resource organizations interact with you. Yeah. And whether or not some of them can even continue interacting with you, like radically changes. And so it's those frameworks of both socially, of like, did we actually give you these skills, or did we just say that you need to have these skills because now you can vote? And I don't remember what other landmark we get at 18. I think it might be smoke, but like, now you should be able to do these things regardless of whether we have set you up for them. And also legally, here's a bunch of consequences depending on what you do.
Yeah.
Which we are coming up on our time, so I would like to build us into, since I am leading us into wild weeds, what are protective factors we can use we can support that youth in engage? Goodness. Hello, everyone. It is late afternoon here. What are protective factors we can support youth engaged in survival sex work in building? Y'all were touching on it, so let's just
I think that, a lot of it's what we've been talking about in being able to identify healthy parts of relationships and undesirable parts of relationships. And I even refrain from, I hesitate to say like unhealthy, because that goes back to the question of like, who's saying that? From the outside, it might look unhealthy, but if it is acceptable to someone in the relationship, that's hard to navigate. A big question. Maybe we don't have time to go too deep into that, but identifying those, this is good about the relationship, I like this, and this is not. And even grander scales, this relationship altogether as a whole is not working for me. And so that being able to identify that and see those red flags and the green flags is an important factor and skill. Again, not just in transactional and or sexual relationships, but just in relationships in general. It's an important skill to have. And so that's one thing that we can, when working with youth, help them build, and modeling that with them. Like I said earlier, that therapeutic relationship often can start with distrust, because there's uncertainty about what the therapist or the social worker or whatever professional, or just a friendly community member who says, hey, I see you're out here, I've got a couch. That's a really scary thing to navigate, because in the past someone offered me a couch and there's something tied to it, and in some instances there is nothing, and it's legitimately a community that wants to help, and then the next day they get them connected to other services and get into a housing program, and so being able to identify those things, and the professionals can model that as well by showing, you can have someone that's trying to support you without expecting payment, any kind of services or goods in return. And even when you trust that person, it's good and healthy to have boundaries and to model that with them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, as both professionals and community members, like modeling safe relationships and relationships full of choice is always going to be beneficial to any young person, regardless of their circumstances. And really, like, helping them, encouraging them to explore new forms of like safe intimacy, like allowing them to have moments where they're like, this feels good, is going to help them recognize moments that don't feel good, and help them in just like the simplest terms. You know what I mean? Like helping them to develop these safe and consensual relationships is going to help them navigate more complicated relationships in the future and in the present. So yeah, just going back to what Caleb said, modeling those relationships in a professional capacity and in a personal capacity is always going to be so important.
Yeah, I think giving people a space to build out that yes, because it's no is often a place I think we focus on in consent models of building the parameters of no. What does no look like?
Right.
But that's leaves out a huge swath of people who have no context for what yes looks like.
Right.
It's like we need support in building that too.
Absolutely.
And y'all hit on it, but to hit us to home and bring us to a close of, in general, as adults, what are ways we can support youth? You know, massive question for the end.
Definitely all those things we were saying before. And on a like a larger note, I mean, we touched on this previously, but you know, we don't just have an obligation as a practitioner. We also have an obligation as a community member to make a world where these choices aren't criminalized. So working towards the decriminalization of sex work, working towards the decriminalization of things like drug usage, and also opening up these conversations on immigration. These are always going to have impacts on kids that are navigating these transactional sexual relationships.
And I think to me the core of the decriminalization is choice, expanding choices, expanding options. Minors in our society, minors are one of the most controlled populations of people, right? So apart from like prisoners and incarcerated people, there's not a lot of groups that are more heavily controlled. Kids and young people are told where to go, when to be there, how to act there. And so to expand their choice and expand their agency and opportunities to exhibit their agency is really important. And then echoing what Zoe said, that everything we talked about in relationship to survival sex and to commercial sex really are concepts that apply to all areas of life, because it applies. Consent is something that applies to all relationships and all forms of intimacy, as is choice and identifying what feels good, and respecting and building trust and all those things. So those all apply. And I think the biggest thing for me and adults working with young people is just recognizing again that they are people and they have agency. How can we let them portray that and make choices and have power over their own lives?
I think that was I know it was a big question, but I think y'all still gave a good bubble on that. And I really appreciate y'all taking the time to dive into this really expansive and also this massive, but also still very important and nuanced subject that, the core thing is recognize youth as people who have choices and understanding of why they are making those choices. And I just want to thank you both and thank everyone else out there for listening and or watching to us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I do, if I could just say one thing, I love having these conversations. Zoe and I met because a mutual contact put us in touch to talk about this kind of stuff. And we've had hours and hours of conversations trying to distill for this conversation presentation, what are some of the key things we want to talk about? And there's so much we didn't talk about that I think is important. And so if you're interested and want to talk, feel free to reach out to me. I love
We're here.
meeting folks who
How
wanna
can they
talk
reach out
about
to
it.
you?
Yeah. I don't know. Do the bios have our email, our contacts?
Your bios do not have your contact information. If there is a social media handle, a email that you don't mind sharing with the public, if you would like to say it aloud right here, right now, and I will put it in the description, everyone, once this video is posted.
Great. Yeah, I don't have any like Instagram or anything to follow, but you can feel free to email me b.caleb, so b.caleb at whistle.edu, wustl.edu.
Yeah, same for me. I unfortunately, social media is not my forte, but you can definitely email me at my email, which is zwebbfc. So that's ZWEBB, F as in Facebook, C as in cat at gmail.com. And I will get back to you. Yeah.
Solid. Thank y'all for extending that open door for continuing conversations.
Always.
And lovely people, I hope you take them up on that and take care.